Okay, we also talked about stress. So if you go into the next slide on stress hormones, we know that stress hormones also can be related to predisposing somebody to depression. So everyone has what's called the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamus in the brain, the pituitary in the gland in the brain, sometimes referred to as the master gland, and then the adrenal cortex on top of your kidneys. Okay, so in a stressful situation that has a finite expiry date, meaning it's abrupt or it's short-lived, your body is very well prepared to releasing cortisol from your adrenal cortex to deal with that. However, in depression, though, we find that in the depressed individual, not all of them, but a good chunk of depressed individuals have very, very high cortisol levels. It's as though this HPA axis is overactive in people who suffer from depression. Okay, so what about genes? If we go on to the next slide, we can find out more about genetic causes. I guess the best way or the best place to look at genetic contribution is to look at identical twins who share 100% of their genes. So whatever similarity between the twins that persists regardless of the similar environments has to be due to genetics. And we know that identical twins, if one has depression, the other identical twin has a 50% chance of also having depression. Okay? And if they're just siblings, meaning they're not identical twins, and they share only a part of their genes, then your brother or sister, if you are depressed, have a 25% chance of developing depression. So all of that is pointing to some genetic contribution to depression. Some of the genes associated with depression also predispose the individual to other things like anxiety disorders and other psychiatric disorders and medical ones. And if you have a relative who was diagnosed with early onset of depression before age 30, you're much more likely to develop depression if you have a close familial relationship to that person. Again, all evidence leading or providing support for a genetic hypothesis of depression. So let's move on to the next slide to learn more about genetic causes for depression. Let's focus on one gene that has fruited the literature on genetics and depression, and that is a gene that controls how a chemical, serotonin, is recycled in the brain. Okay, so on the bottom right, we have in yellow a depiction of a neuron, a nerve cell, that's talking to another neuron, another nerve cell, the green one, and that talking and that communication happens chemically via a neurotransmitter, a chemical called serotonin. Now, I already prefaced this by saying a few slides ago that serotonin levels or there's a depletion of serotonin in the depressed brain. Okay, so one would think, well, if we increase serotonin, then we can alleviate depression. Or people who have genetic predisposition where the gene that is responsible for serotonin, there's something wrong with it, then they might have a genetic predisposition for depression. Well, as it turned out, one of the genes that's responsible for recycling serotonin in some depressed individuals is malfunctioning. What does that mean? You get one version of your gene from the mother and one from the father. So, in one form, if you happen to get what's called the short form from this gene from the mother and from the father, so you have short and short, you're much more likely to get depression after a stressful event than somebody who has the long forms of this gene. Okay, so we definitely know genetic is important. But if we advance to the next slide, the heading of that slide is genetic story is not that simple. Okay, so there are way too many genes involved to focus on only one gene to predict whether someone is going to develop depression or not. And if we move to the next slide, okay, moving to the next slide, and if I may revisit that quote again by Kendall and Stein in 2004, scientists estimate that approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of our approximately 30,000 genes affect development and regulation of the nervous system. In turn, this is now the new very important part, at least half of these genes depend on environmental stimulation to be activated. Aha. So even if you have the genetic predisposition for depression, unless you have an environmental stimulus to activate them, you might not actually develop depression. If we move on to the next slide, that makes the point beautifully in this study by Caspi in 2003. I love this figure so much that I wish I can actually have it, saved as my screensaver on my mobile, on my cell phone, and just show it to everybody. On the x-axis, I have the number of stressful life events early in life, from 0 to 4+. On the y-axis, I have the probability of experiencing a major depressive episode. The different colorful lines indicate your genetic predisposition. SS, or getting a short allele or a short form from your mother and a short form from your father, is the worst type of genetic background, or the one that predisposes you to depression. Having long, or the LL would mean that you have the lowest risk of depression, or almost a protective genetic factor. And then having one short and one long puts you at intermediate risk. But look at this. If we look at 0 number of stressful events, or even 1 stressful event, or even 2 stressful events, your genetic makeup does not matter. However, if you experience 3 or 4+ events, that's really when the genes matter. So if we look at the short versus the long, the red line and the blue line, for 4+, meaning 4+ stressors early in life, you see that your risk, if you have the protective genes, the LL, is maybe 10, 11, 12% for depression. But if you have the short combination, your risk jumps to 40%. That's when genes matter. But they don't matter alone. It's almost like the environment uncovers your genetic makeup.